we've become too sedentary. We have lost our resilience because we're no longer exposed to the highs and lows of temperatures, the exercise variations, the immune challenges that we were once exposed to. And that makes us much less resilient. And it means now, as we see average air temperatures climbing with climate change, and particularly the peaks of cold snaps and heat waves, that we're having more and more problems because we just don't have that foundation of robustness and resilience that comes from those exposures. The question is, how do you do that, and how do you do it safely? How do you re-establish that?
Welcome to the Degrees of Health podcast. We explore the heat, the cold, and the spectrum of health in between. This week we spoke with Professor Mike Tipton. Mike heads up the Extreme Environments Laboratory at Portsmouth University. In our conversation, we spoke about the dangers of cold water, what happens to your body when cold water hits your skin, autonomic conflict, use it or lose it principle, and what Mike has learned studying humans in extreme environments. It was a really fascinating conversation, and Mike is a very broad cast of mind, discussing a whole number of things related to cold exposure in a sensible, rational, multidisciplinary way. As Anthony D'Angelo once said, become a student of change. It is the only thing that will remain a constant. With that, here's my conversation with Mike Tipton. Great. Well, Mike, firstly, thanks so much for doing this. Big fan of your research and been following along for a while now. Just to sort of set the scene, how does one end up running an extreme environments lab? And what is an extreme environments lab?
Let's start with the second question. Our Extreme Environments Laboratory at the University of Portsmouth is a suite of facilities. So it's 3 chambers. And between them, they go from minus 25 degrees Celsius to plus 50. Humidity control, obviously temperature control. We can take each of those chambers to 8,000 meters, so we can go pretty much to the top of Everest. So we can actually go minus 20 to 8,000 meters. So combining the stresses, therefore, of altitude and hypoxia. And 2 of the chambers have immersion facilities in them. So that one of them is 2.5 meters deep, so we can do some immersion and shallow hyperbaric stuff. And the other chamber, the immersion facility, is a swimming flume, which, for those who don't know, is a swimming treadmill. So you swim along and you stay still. And that's really useful for us because it means we can test people without having to chase them up and down a pool or anything like that. They stay stationary. But we can also do interesting things like get people to swim at altitude. So you can look at interesting combinations. We also have the ability to increase wind speed and solar load and things like that. These are all critical components in the stress that an environment represents. How do you get into it? Well, by chance, really, I guess. I mean, I was a swimmer as a youngster, so I had an interest in water. I wasn't designed to be a swimmer. It was just something my mother was into and had taught for years. And then I did a master's at King's College in London, part of which took me to the Institute of Naval Medicine, where I met a guy called Frank Golden, who was doing a study on swim failure in cold water. So by then I was interested in temperature regulation and how the body controls its temperature and responds to temperature challenges. And so here was a study that actually combined 2 really major interests in my life, temperature regulation and the aquatics or immersion. And so I volunteered to do that study. Frank and I became friends and colleagues, and we worked together for the next third of a century in the area of cold water immersion. The Royal Navy are particularly interested in cold immersion because 2/3 of RN personnel that died in the Second World War did so during the survival phase when they were in cold water. So for various reasons, but even so, it meant that it's as you'd imagine, if you're an organisation that is by, under, or on the sea, or flying over it, then you're pretty interested in what happens if you end up in water.
Definitely. The so many different variables. It sounds like you can test in the lab. When you talk about swimming at altitude, I mean, amazing. What have you learned from Well, actually, what have you learned from people swimming at altitude?
Well, to be honest,
Not
that started off as a bit of well, not a joke, but it was Greg White, a friend and prof up in Liverpool, wanted to do something for his 50th birthday, 50 things or 50 swims for his 50th birthday. So I said, well, if you swim in the flume and we reduce the altitude, then you can claim to be one of the few people who swum uphill. So that was just it. But of course, like any other endurance athletes, then altitude acclimatization is beneficial, both in terms of sea level performance and, of course, performance at altitude. So it's those kind of studies where we take people to altitude have been mostly to do with altitude acclimatization, but they've also, it may be an area we come on to talk about. It's really important to remember that in the natural world, you don't just have altitude, you don't just have cold, you don't just have heat. These things combine, and when you get to altitude, then your susceptibility to freezing and non-freezing cold injury goes up. So if you really want to know what the risks to, say, a high altitude mountaineer are, you really want to be able to combine hypoxia or altitude with a cold stimulus. So we've done that. We've spent quite a lot of time looking at particularly non-freezing cold injury.
Okay, wow. That segues very nicely into the next topic, which I'd love to explore. Which, in one of the papers I read, it opens with a really nice line, which is cold water has been both a villain and a hero throughout history. I'd love to explore the villain side of the coin, the dangers, as you like. You mentioned non-freezing cold injury. I think this is slightly a lesser known one. Maybe we start there. What is non-freezing cold injury? What is non-freezing cold injury?
It's pretty much what it says on the tin. It's a cold injury that occurs without freezing of the tissues. So human tissue freezes at about minus 0.53 degrees Celsius. Incidentally, seawater freezes at about minus 1.9 degrees Celsius. So it's possible to get frostbite in the sea because of the salinity of the water and the temperature it can go to.
Is that because it's salt? It freezes.
Yeah, yeah. So human tissue has some salt in it, but not as much as seawater. So seawater freezes at a lower temperature, so you can get frostbite in the sea. That's not a common problem. However, it has been a problem that's had to be faced by, for example, the Norwegian oil industry. So, of the work we do, about half is fairly fundamental and mechanistic, and then the other half, about a third, is with industry, a third with elite sport, and a third with the military. And with the industry, one of the big industries we've worked with has been the oil industry. So back in the 80s and 90s, we were trying to identify and address some of the major issues faced by people having to go and work in the northern North Sea. And one of those issues was the potential for getting frostbite. However, back to non-freezing cold injury. So non-freezing cold injury occurs without freezing of the tissue. We don't really know very much about it, although it's been around for centuries and has been a major cause of disability in the military, in mountaineers, people sleeping rough. Its symptoms are you get very cold sensitive. So once you've got a cold injury, if you go into the cold, your peripheral blood flow shuts down, because it's particularly with cold injuries like frostbite and non-freezing cold injuries, obviously the extremities that are most susceptible, because as the body cools, it withdraws blood flow from the skin, cutaneous vasoconstriction, in order to protect the deep body tissues. So it'll sacrifice the extremities in order to protect the deep body tissues. So that's why most people have frostbite. Will have it on fingers, nose, ears, toes, places like that.
Oh wow! So it's the body saving vital organs by, I guess, sacrificing the extremities.
Yeah.
Wow, I never knew that.
So going right back, we're a tropical animal, evolving in a place sort of eastern, southeastern Africa, where with an average daytime air temperature of about 26 to 28 degrees and an average nighttime temperature of about 10 degrees. Now we've migrated across the rest of the planet, but our response to the challenges that came from that migration have been addressed by technology, by using our intellect. Other animals have got more fur, have got more blubber, have changed their shape. Humans have always tended to rely on their intellect. So caves, fires, housing, clothing, all of these. And the use of these dates back literally thousands of years in terms of fires and clothing and cave use. But what that means is, right at the core of it all, we haven't changed very much from our evolutionary origins in terms of our thermal preferences. All we've done is we've used technology to recreate next to the skin and through the body the profile that we would have had if we were naked in 28-degree air. So if anyone on the planet says, I feel thermally comfortable, I'll pretty much guarantee they'll be within half a degree of a mean skin temperature of 33 degrees Celsius. Their core temperature will be 37, their mean skin temperature will be 33, and that's a gradient down which, in an air temperature of 26 to 28 degrees Celsius, heat can flow without you having to shiver or sweat so this is a thermoneutral zone, and it's where we evolved. And of course, what's the best temperature for exercising in? It's an air temperature of 10 or 11 degrees Celsius, which was the early morning temperature where we evolved. So we've not really progressed much in terms of our thermoregulatory preferences. All we've done is used technology to recreate next to the skin the same environment as we would be in if we were back where we evolved. That's great whilst that technology works. But then the two sides of the coin is when it doesn't work because there's an accident or something stop, you get your helicopter ditches, you fall over the side of the boat, your heating system stops working, your car breaks down, then we don't have very much resilience. We don't have very much capability to generate the heat necessary to keep us warm. And of course, the other side of the coin is that we've become so good at controlling our environment and getting those thermal profiles we want that we hardly ever perturb the system. So you're sitting there perfectly comfortable. You'll be perfectly comfortable all day. Even if you go outside on this freezing cold day, you'll put enough clothing on and you'll heat your car enough, not really to experience cold or heat. And we've become what I call thermostatic. And the problem with that is we're not challenging or perturbing the systems necessary to maintain functionality. And we all know that with the musculoskeletal system, that if you don't challenge it, it's the use it or lose it phenomenon. That you'll get muscle atrophy, diminished mineralization of the skeleton. Well, the same thing happens with your immune system. The same thing happens with your thermoregulatory system, your biochemical systems, your metabolic systems. And we've just become too sedentary, too comfortable, and too capable of using technology to control our environment. And the problem also with that, of course, is the technology we're using consumes resources, requires fossil fuels to be burnt, which is contributing to, the existential threat to the species.
It's amazing. Do you think there's a human benefit to exposing ourselves to various different temperature and getting out?
Yeah, I do. I'm constantly walking the knife edge between telling people to be careful and telling people to do stuff. Because yes, absolutely, I think one of our problems is we've become obviously we're talking about high income and in a sort of geographical north in particular. We've become too sedentary. We have lost our resilience because we're no longer exposed to the highs and lows of temperatures, the exercise variations, the immune challenges that we were once exposed to. And that makes us much less resilient. And it means now, as we see average air temperatures climbing with climate change, and particularly the peaks of cold snaps and heat waves, that we're having more and more problems because we just don't have that foundation of robustness and resilience that comes from those exposures. the question is, how do you do that, and how do you do it safely? How do you re-establish that? And that's an interesting part of the discussion.
Definitely. Let's get into that then. So, what do we need to be aware of? What are the main cold hazards that actually happen when people get cold exposure wrong? Whether it be cold swimming or plunging, what do we have to be cautious of? What could happen?
Well, let's go right back to where this sidetrack started, which was with non-freezing cold injury. So, non-freezing cold injury is damage to the peripheral neurovasculature, and we don't really know, or despite trying, but we don't really know the extent to which this is neural, is vasculature. We don't know the pathogenesis. We don't know even the pathology, but we do know that with varying degrees of exposure to cold, particularly cold wet. So, I mean, this thing has been called paddy foot, trench foot in the past. That exposure to cold, damp situations, cold, wet situations, can produce a non-freezing cold injury. So, i.e., the tissues haven't frozen, and that leaves you with cold sensitivity. It leaves you with hyperhidrosis. So you sweat in the injured part, and you're left with intractable pain, and that can last for the rest of your life, and can progress to the requirement for amputation. So it's not that much of a difference in terms of outcome to something like frostbite in that regard. Most people who go into the cold for leisure pursuits have never heard of non-freezing cold injury, but I suspect, like me, they're at least moderately cold injured. And if you talk to them about, do you find that your feet get cold very quickly, stay cold for a long while, are hard to warm up, are sometimes painful? Well, that's you're starting along the progression of non-freezing cold injury. The other risks, aside from that, are the cold produces a sudden vasoconstriction, as we've talked about, withdrawing blood from the extremities, sacrificing them to protect the deep body tissues. That pushes up blood pressure. So you've now got a reduction in your peripheral blood flow, and there's an increase in your cardiac output. So that increases the pressure of the system. So you get hypertension. And that is particularly hazardous for people with pre-existing hypertension, aneurysms, where people susceptible to cardiovascular incidents. With going into cold water, not cold air, because this requires a sudden fall in skin temperature. That sudden fall in skin temperature stimulates the cold receptors that are about 0.18 millimeters below the surface of the skin, and produces what we termed back in the 80s cold shock. You'll hear it referred to as cold water shock in some places, but it's cold shock, and it's a gasp, it's a hyperventilation, it's an increase in the blood pressure, increase in the workload of the heart. And it is responsible for up to about 60% of the deaths that we see on immersion in cold water. I mean, the thing that got me into this area originally were the statistics. And those statistics were something like, worldwide, there's about 1,000 immersion deaths a day. That's an underestimation, because a lot of the deaths are in countries, low-income countries, where the deaths aren't recorded. So that's 1,000 deaths a day. In the UK, it's about the death every 30 hours and one child a week. And originally, it was thought that those deaths were due to hypothermia. That persisted right through until probably the 60s and 70s, where we started to see evidence from the statistics, the laboratories, anecdotal accounts, that something much more rapid was killing people. The Home Office published a report in 1977 saying 2/3 of those that died within a couple of meters of a safe refuge, and were regarded as good swimmers. That's not hypothermia, that's something very quick. And that led us on to investigate sudden immersion in cold water, and to identify cold shock as a precursor to cardiac problems and drowning on immersion. So, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was just going to say, so was it the cold shock, or is this the segue to the autonomic conflict?
No, it's cold shock. I'll talk to you a bit about autonomic conflict. So if we just finished a cold shock, so your gasp with cold shock is 2 to 3 liters. The lethal dose of salt water into the lung for the starting of the drowning process is about 1.5 litres. So that first is sufficient. If your airway happens to be under the water, you're in choppy water, it's breaking on your face, you've fallen from a height, you're in a ditched, inverted craft, that first breath in is sufficient to cause drowning. If you do a head out immersion, then you'll just stimulate the skin receptors from there down, and those skin receptors will produce cold shock. If you just do a face immersion, which is a classic student protocol, you stimulate the ophthalmic division of the trigeminal nerve. These are cold receptors around the eyes and nose and mouth, and that produces the diving response, which has been known about since Paul Burt first wrote about it in 1870. And that diving response slows the heart, helps you breath hold, and changes the distribution of blood within the body to keep your blood pressure normal. And it's a response which diving mammals have to go under the water for, in the case of a large whale, for maybe 90 minutes. The problem we have as humans is we have a sort of weak diving response. It's stronger when you're a child, and it diminishes with age. And we have a cold shock response, and those two responses are in conflict. So if I do a head out immersion, I'm only going to get the cold shock response. If the water splashes on my face and I breath hold, I've now got two responses going into the heart. The cold shock response is trying to up the heart rate. That's the cold shock response. It's a sympathetic nervous system driven response that increases the strength of contractility of the heart and the heart rate. But I've also now stimulated the diving response, which is trying to decrease the contractility of the heart and slow the heart rate. And what we've found is that those two responses conflict. They're the two arms of the autonomic nervous system: cold shock sympathetic, diving response parasympathetic nervous system. And those two responses conflict. And within about 10 seconds of breaking breath hold, when you're in that situation where the water's on your face or you're going under the water, you'll see some form of cardiac arrhythmia in about 83% of otherwise young, fit, healthy individuals. And normally that's it's a very reproducible way of producing those arrhythmias, but normally they're not that catastrophic. However, if you happen to have some predisposing factors like cardiovascular disease, long QT syndrome, some channel abnormalities in your heart, ionic channel abnormalities, then those responses can progress to more dangerous ECG abnormalities. We've called it, Mike Shattuck, professor at King's, cellular cardiologist, and I worked together on this over a decade ago now, and we called it autonomic conflict because it's a conflict between the two arms of the diving response and the cold shock response, the two arms of the autonomic nervous system. Interesting academically, interesting in terms of cardiac responses, but so what I hear everyone shouting. Well, it's worth noting that around about 80% of those that die, for example, in triathlons, die during the swim, and they particularly die during the mass starts and where people come to turn around buoys, because people come together and congregate. Now, those people haven't died when they were training. So the question is, what is it about the event that's made them more likely to, and the deaths are quite often cardiac in cause. And the question is, what is it about the event that's made that more likely? We think it's autonomic conflict. We think that people they've started in this melee of people. They've turned to breathe and they've not been able to because there's a plume of water on their face from the person next to them. So they extend their breath hold. Their sympathetic drive is up because they're in a big event. Their diving response is evoked because they're now holding their breath with their face covered in water. And on the next breath they take, they get this cardiac arrhythmia, which descends into something more dangerous. So, from the nice thing about applied physiology, Ben, is you start off with all that stuff I was talking about in terms of cold receptors and cardiac responses. And you come to something like, well, actually organize your triathlon so that people don't end up, going out on a mass start. Have small waves. If you're going to go and do open water swimming, avoid breath holding when you're swimming. If you can avoid having your face in the water and holding your breath and swimming for as long as you can on a breath hold, you significantly decrease your chance of having a cardiac problem. So again, the nice thing about applied physiology is you understand the mechanisms, and then you tease that through to just some simple practical advice. And we can talk about that in terms of the design of emergency breathing systems. We can talk about that in terms of how you get people out of the water, what you say to them when you're getting them out of the water. All follows that same pattern of understand the physiology, understand the mechanism, because it'll allow you to give scientifically underpinned valid advice.
I think the appetite for the understanding of the mechanisms is sort of higher than it's ever been with the new found interest in cold swimming and cold water immersion, be it static in an ice bath or swimming in a cold body of water. So just so I and the listener understand, the thing to be wary of when it comes to sort of autonomic conflict is the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, so the fight and flight, plus the mammalian dive reflex, which is in conflict with that, plus a breath hold is you don't want to.
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to go swimming and you're going to do freestyle, so your face is going to be in the water, keep breathing regularly. We have had incidents where people have gone in the water, decided they're going to swim out on a breath hold as far as they can, and when they break their breath hold, they then have to be rescued. If I do a head out immersion, I've got as a young, fit, healthy individual, remember, because all our studies are done on people who are obviously volunteers, but have also had a full medical. They're under the age of 39. And we'll see about a 1% incidence of cardiac arrhythmia if it's a head out immersion. As soon as we add a breath hold to that, it goes up to about 60%. And if we add a face in breath hold to that, an extended breath hold, it's up to about 83-84%. So it's a remarkably good way of confusing the heart, and it really is to be avoided. Now, if you start saying, well, I'm now somebody in my 50s, I've probably got a little bit of cardiovascular disease, it's even more imperative that you don't combine that face-in, protracted breath hold combination that is likely to evoke autonomic conflict.
Definitely. I think that's such valuable information, because I think you see all sorts of people. I mean, Eloise and I, we like to get in our plunge most days, but you see all sorts of people just sort of touting all sorts of advice online and, challenges and dunking the head up with ice bath without any information or context. So I think that's a really important message to get across.
Well, we see it, I would even avoid doing things like if I'm sitting in cold water, splashing water on my face. I just would avoid that. I mean, I think we had quite a few cardiac issues early in the morning when people get out of bed and go in and wash their face. We know that from the ice bucket challenge, we had several people have problems. And we think the reason we didn't see more is because most people who did the ice bucket challenge put their head down and poured the water on the back of their head. So it plumed out like that and didn't hit this area. The ones that we heard about that had a problem had done it like that. They put their head back and poured the water on their face. So, it's just a sensible thing to minimize your risk. I mean, what we're all about, we're not trying to stop people doing stuff. As you heard at the start, I'm quite keen for people to do things. But it's just a matter of giving people the information that enables them to maximize the benefits and minimize the potential risks. That's cold shock. So that's the other important thing to note about that is those cold receptors adapt within about a minute to 90 seconds. So even though you're experiencing it in the first minute of immersion, the gasping, the hyperventilation, just knowing that it's going to go away improves your survival prospects. We know that. We've done studies that show that the people that know that this is going to abate do better than those that don't. It's the neurophysiological equivalent of it's okay once you're in. You get the skin gets down to the water temperature, that you've no longer got the dynamic response of those cold receptors, which is what was driving cold shock. And now people report being pretty comfortable. Once that's happened, the next issue is as the cold front moves into the body, the superficial nerves and muscles cool, and they're particularly the arms are particularly susceptible to cooling because they're thin, long cylinders twice the surface area to mass ratio of the legs, half the conductive pathway, very superficially running nerves and muscles. And if you put somebody into water between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius, within about 10 minutes, they can become physically incapacitated to the point of not being able to swim. And so the next bit of advice is, if this is something that you're doing, then don't stay in for more than 10 minutes. There are obviously people who swim the channel and these are specialists. It's a bit like, there are people who go to the top of Everest. You wouldn't take the average person and put them at the top of Everest. So, but for the general population, it's probably a good idea if you're in very cold water not to stay in for more than 5 or 10 minutes. And if you're in the summer and it's a bit warmer, even then, 20 minutes, because it's not a hypothermia. You're not going to become hypothermic in less than 30 minutes in even the coldest water, because we're just too big. We've got too much heat stored in us. But you can get cold shock, you can get peripheral cooling, physical incapacitation long before that. So I think it's we've had incidents of people swimming offshore and then not being able to get back. So silly things like, if you're going to swim parallel to the shore and try and stay in your depth. So if you start to feel a reduction in your physical capability, your ability to swim, you can just stand up. The cardiorespiratory, drowning, cardiac problems, physical incapacitation, neuromuscular incapacitation, all are risks associated with going into cold water. You don't see cold shock when you go into cold air because it just simply doesn't cool the skin quick enough. You do see on water. And then finally, you get into hypothermia. But the vast majority of people are not going to have a problem with that unless they overstay their welcome or they become injured or incapacitated in a very cold environment.
It's really interesting. I've been using the ice bath and familiar with cold exposure for a while, and I've noticed that the gasp response, that fight or flight, is dramatically less now. We had to break the ice on the plunge this morning, and that was still there. But the difference between starting cold exposure and that shock response versus when you actually, you're a bit more practice and your body is slightly more adapted. I've noticed in myself and others that massively shrinks, and you get more comfortable. Saying that, it's probably the strong swimmers drown, right? So there's an element of
there's a couple of interesting points that come from that. Yes, we have a real ability to habituate to that response, and it's habituation because it's a decreased response to a constant stimulus in terms of the water temperature. And in as few as sort of 6 2 or 3 minute immersions, we've shown that you can halve that cold shock response that you're talking about, the gasp and the hyperventilation. And then 14 months later, which is as long as we managed to convince people to come back, really, we ran out of friends at 14 months. Even then, the cold shock response was still reduced by 25%. So it's a fairly significant change. We've done some interesting experiments around that habituation. So we've repeatedly immersed one half of the body and got an habituation. This bit, the bit that stayed in air or had a wetsuit on, was kept warm. When you flip people over and immerse the bit that's never been in the water, they still show that habituation. So it's occurring more central than the peripheral cold receptors, which is interesting, which may explain why it's quite permanent. When you put somebody like Lewis Pugh into the cold water, who's the guy who swims to raise the issue of plastic in the oceans and climate change, great guy.
Am I right? He swam in the Arctic and Antarctic.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. No, he does a lot, and he also swam all the way along the south coast of Britain. So he was talking about crossing the channel, but doing it the lengthwise rather than the widthwise. And when he swam past Portsmouth, before he did it, to be fair, he came to the lab just to check, because he can go into the swimming flume that we've got. He can do the swim. We can get him to swallow a pill that transmits his deep body temperature. We can measure how much energy he's expending, and we can say, yeah, okay, provided the water temperature is this, you're exercising this hard, you can go for this long. And that's the kind of way we could help somebody like him, Lewis. But when he got into the cold water, if you were just looking at the trace of his breathing and his heart, you wouldn't have known where he got in the cold water. because there was no change. He is so habituated to cold that it was an absolute flat line in terms of change in heart rate or change in breathing. So that
I'm really,
shows you the extent to which you can habituate.
I mean, a massive tick in the box of use it or lose it principle, I guess, which I think is a general rule from, I mean, I find it with reading. If I take a week off reading, I feel less sharp, like I'm processing information slower. And
Yeah.
wonderful tick in that box. I'm pleased you mentioned Lewis Pugh, is it?
Yeah.
I read recently, and I'd love your take on this, that when he went to the Antarctic, his temperature was being measured before he got in the water. And it was as if the temperature of his internal body started rising before he got in the cold water, almost like a Pavlovian stimulus and response. He sees the cold water and his body responds in a way. I mean, I'd love your take on that.
A healthy skepticism. That's my take.
Okay.
as it should be with most people, with most things. I mean, I think we've become a little bit too accepting in terms of some of the things we're told, and particularly as more and more people have access to tell people more and more things without actually having done any of the basic research to actually understand what's going on. So that Lewis works a lot with Tim Noakes, who's a very good scientist in South Africa that I know and I'm friends with and respect. It's quite difficult. This anticipatory rise in metabolism is what you're talking about. It's quite difficult to tease out, and it has been reported. But I can also tell you that when we have people going into a lab where they're going to do a cold water immersion, they will have an increase just because of anxiety. I mean, if you're about to dive into cold water or jump into cold water, you're going to have a sympathetic response, and that's going to shut down your peripheral blood flow a bit. You're going to get cold, clammy hands. You're going to increase your metabolic rate. If you happen to go into a cool environment next to the pool as well, then you're going to up your metabolic rate further. And so at that time, you've got quite a lot going on, which is conserving and increasing heat production, but no heat loss going on. So it's not surprising in that situation that you see an increase in body temperature. So, if that, I mean, so that would be my explanation, rather than something like a psychologically driven metabolic response.
Okay. Yes.
In fact, when you go into cold water, the vast majority of people, if you measure their deep body temperature by whichever route you want to use, will not change for 5 or 10 minutes. In fact, it may well go up for the first 5 or 10 minutes for the reasons I've just said. Your heat production and heat loss, minimizing heat loss responses are all neurogenically driven. So as soon as that skin temperature falls, you'll start some gentle shivering, some without it's shivering. You'll vasoconstrict, but it takes a while for you to start losing temperature from the core of your body because, as I say, we're a big animal, and it takes a while for that cold front to get to the core. So for the first few minutes of an immersion, you've got heat production exceeding heat loss. So deep body temperature goes up. And then eventually you'll see it start to come down. So all of this, pre-cold or early cold exposure increases in temperature, I think can be explained by the mechanisms by which heat loss is reduced, heat production is increased, and core temperature conductive gradients are established. It's a timing function, I think.
Okay, fantastic. That's super interesting. There's always I think the trap for people who are new to this, including myself, is there's always often more than one mechanism that can be proposed, and I think people can jump on one mechanism and ignore the other side of the coin. So I think that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, of course, the important thing for people who are going into cold water is the reverse happens when you come out. And so when you come out, by the time you come out, you've established a cooling gradient, and that's from the skin through the superficial tissues to the core. If I now come out and go into warm water or put on a robe to try and warm me up, that will warm the skin, but it's going to take a while for that warm front to move into the center of the body. Meanwhile, the core will still be losing heat to the intermediate tissues, and that's what's been called the afterdrop. It's just a phenomenon of the fact that your core temperature changes when you go into cold and come out of cold are conductive, and those conductive pathways take 5 or 10 minutes to reverse. So if you measure somebody's core temperature and all they've done is come out of the water and wrap themselves up and to get warm, it'll be at the coldest it's been all day about 10 minutes after they leave the water.
That's
That's not a good time to be driving a car, incidentally.
yes. Well, that's the point I was gonna mention of the I think one of the biggest risks is when you're operating heavy machinery or suddenly going about your normal day after a cold swim, which I think just having a general awareness of is very useful. Okay, so we've covered a lot of the risks associated with it. On the other side of the coin, what are the benefits? As somebody who's studied this intensely, what would you say the main benefits of cold water exposure are?
Yeah, I mean, just let me mention 2 or 3 other quick things because people may. So we've talked about the thermal. We're also seeing an increased incidence of swimming-induced pulmonary edema, where the lungs start to accumulate fluid, and it's to do with the cold vasoconstriction, wearing a tight wetsuit, and if you start to feel that you've got that, you need to come out of the water, loosen the wetsuit, sit down, do pursed lips breathing, get to hospital, and warn people that you may have SIPE. And the other thing that I'm seeing more and more of, simply because of the numbers involved, because the numbers going into cold water for the beneficial side of things has absolutely gone up exponentially. And we're seeing, as a consequence of things, more of things like transient global amnesia, where people go into the cold water, come out and can't remember having been, they lose their memory. This was made particularly high profile because Michael Mosley, who does a lot of BBC Science work, suffered it. And again, it's not long lasting, although you don't ever seem to remember the immersion, but you get everything else back. You remember everything else. And there are various. It's about 1 in 100,000, so 1 in 10,000 people. Major risk factor: history of migraines, short-lived, 8 to 10 hours. No really long-term effects, as I say, apart from not being able to remember the episode. And it's seen in cold water immersion. It's seen in sporting events, and occasionally it's seen following sex.
So right, I can't
Getting
remember
cold
it.
at a sporting event and having combining those three is not very good.
Probably not going to win yourself any fans if you
No.
not remember it. What's the proposed mechanism behind that? Just out of interest.
Unknown. Unknown. I mean, going into cold is. I mean, that you do. I mean, there is a fairly large neural activation going on. I mean, all those cold receptors are sending afferents into the central nervous system. You've probably done a bit of hyperventilating, so you've changed your cerebral blood flow. So, but nobody really knows. All they can say is it's mostly affects older men, although the last 2 incidents I've been told about and been talking about have been older women rather than men. And as I say, it's it's another thing where we don't really know the pathology in terms of the cause, but we just through the number of cases that we're seeing is starting to piece together the profile of the person, older person, a history of migraines. But there's it's going to either be a blood flow issue or just a neural afferent input, I think, but probably a blood flow.
Interesting. Really, really interesting. I think there's so many different levers that cold exposure pulls on. It's always quite, definitely interesting when you see these extreme cases to hypothesize about a mechanism. We just while we're on that, I think there's a nice tangent to this question. There's so many different ways this literature could go. Where do you see it going over the next 5 to 10 years?
What's that?
With the literature around cold exposure.
Oh, so I think we did. I mean, I'll send you some links to a few papers that people can have a look at if they want to, to follow up on some of the things I've been saying. I think what we'll see, I think the area of cold, the kill side of the kill cure aspect of cold water immersion, I think has been pretty well researched. I think we'll see some more stuff on the more recent concepts like autonomic conflict, but I think we know quite a lot about the physiological pathways to cardiac problems and drowning, and it's been well researched and it's in the literature and available. The cure side that we've coming on to talk about is much less well researched. It's much more dependent on anecdote, and I think we'll see better and better studies. I mean, the problem with that side of things is, people are doing different cold exposures. There's no proper matched controls. People are at different levels of acclimatization. They're different ages. They're different fitnesses. They're going in for different periods of time. There's a placebo effect of doing it. I mean, if you imagine what happens when somebody goes down for a swim in the sea, they normally meet up with other people. They're in a beautiful environment. They go into water which is weight bearing. It's cold. They do some exercise, and then they come out and they feel like they've achieved something. They've conquered cold water. They have a hot chocolate, a piece of cake. Now, any one of those could be the active ingredient in making this make you feel better. We know, for example, that exercise does the same thing. It's whether. So what's really required, and we'll see, I think, in the next few years, colleagues at Portsmouth that I work with on this area, somebody like Dr. Heather Massey is doing research in this area, where we will start to see controls where you isolate cold as the active ingredient. You're moving towards it by doing an ice bath, because when you do an ice bath, you're going into water, but you're really getting cold. You're not meeting other people, having hot chocolate, going into a blue-green environment, therapy. So there's some that's kind of moving in the right direction. But what we're really lacking is properly controlled the controls. At the end of last year, there was a paper done where I think they started off with around about 9,000 papers. And by the time they'd sifted them, they ended up with about 24 papers and of those, about 15 probably had a bias, 3 weak chance of a bias. And what that means is that you can't have the same level of confidence in the findings. So we need properly controlled, randomized trials that will give us some idea of the active ingredient. Now, for the people who are doing it, like yourself, you don't care. I mean, you're getting benefit from this, or that's your. And in fact, the papers that have been published, the most common reported benefit is a perception of well-being, a perception of improving health. When you start looking at the immune system, the jury is still out. When you look at the inflammatory related issues, which cold can be good for, we have some hypotheses, some proposed mechanisms, but none that have been tested. So that's where we'll see the difference in the next few years.
I mean, to make it more confusing as well, I think a lot of the proposed benefits are mental, and that makes it even harder to test. I mean, how do you test for a general feeling of psychological resilience and well-being, and the micro stresses of the day wash over you slightly less and affect you less? That's the one thing anecdotally I can definitely say is your perception to stress from a physiological point of view, or my perception of stress from a physiological point of view, seems better able to handle stress, which is interesting.
So I mean, just following up on that, I mean, we have hypotheses for why this may be beneficial. And for example, you talk about stress, psychological stress. Well, cold water is a stress, and we think that the adaptation that you get, that we've talked about, to cold, may well not be specific to cold. It may have some crossover, some cross-adaptive aspect to other stressors in your life, and maybe down at even a cellular level, your tolerance to stress, where where you have some common pathways that are basically the response to stress, whether that be cold, whether that be heat, whether that be psychological, are actually improved, and so your resilience improves. Now, that's pure speculation. I have no evidence other than, I can describe some pathways. I can say, I can talk about, potential mechanisms, but they've not been tested. Now, for you, that's really interesting. But whilst you're anecdotally experiencing or perceiving these benefits, and for the loads and loads of people that I talk to, I do lots of work, for example, with the blue tits, who are a tremendous force for good in terms of water safety. And I've been at events where the numbers here locally in Perranporth have gone from 25 to 1,000 members. And some of these people are in tears talking about the benefits that they've accrued from doing this activity. And that's all they need to know. But what I want to know, for the same reasons that we discussed all the way through this tour, I want to know the mechanisms, because if you can evoke those mechanisms in a different way, by maybe doing a cold pressor test, immersing a hand and a foot in cold water rather than the whole body, then you're making that then available to people who can't go into ice baths, can't go into swimming, for whatever reason, either accessibility or other conditions. So
I guess that minimum effective dose whilst
exactly.
being the most safe way
Yeah.
to get the benefit.
And what's the mechanism, and therefore exactly, it's, what's the least I have to do to get? Wouldn't it be great if all you had to do was stick a finger into a teacup full of iced water? It's not going to happen like that, but it won't be whole body. I can tell you it won't be whole body, because we've done studies where we've immersed half the body and seen the same physiological responses.
Brilliant.
On a similar line, the big mistake people make is they think that longer is better. And we've talked about the cold shock response that peaks in the first few seconds of immersion and then is gone within about 90 seconds. And if I was to hazard a guess, again, it's speculative and hypothetical, but I would argue that that's probably the response that, is the most dangerous associated with cold water, but is also the response that underpins the benefits of going into cold water, whether that be the the claimed improvements to the immune system. Short-term cold water immersions may prime the immune system. We know that longer-term immersions, particularly where you get falls in deep body temperature, actually impair the immune system. We know that the release of adrenaline, all the stress hormones on initial immersion, is undoubtedly the mechanism by which cold water sets you up for the day, makes you feel good about yourself. And we also know that adaptation of the cold shock response is probably the thing that underpins that cross-adaptive effect. So if you were to say to me, what's the dose of cold? Well, I would say we know the cold shock response peaks between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius water. When it goes below that, all that happens is you don't get a larger physiological response. It just feels colder and is more painful until you get down to 0 to 4 degrees Celsius, where it's cold pain receptors that are firing. And also, we know that the cold shock response peaks and is over and done within 90 seconds. So I would say, if I was going to say what's a minimum dose, I would say perhaps 90 seconds, 1 minute to 90 seconds in water between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. That study's not been done, so I don't know. But my worry is that, because I know what happens when we do a lot of work with elite athletes and you talk about acclimatizing them, and they think, well, if I'm supposed to do 10 minutes, if I do 20 minutes, it'll be twice as good. It doesn't work like that with temperature. All that happens when you do 20 minutes rather than 10 is you increase the risk twofold rather than increasing the benefit.
Sort of non-linear in the other way.
Yeah.
On that is so interesting, because I was reading lots into sort of brown fat, and apparently the mechanism goes cold shock response or autonomic arousal, followed by norepinephrine in the brain or adrenaline in the brain, and then that stimulates the hypothalamus to then, I guess, stimulate your brown fat, or I don't know, brown fat mitogenesis or whatever it is. But I was reading that apparently the mechanism is through norepinephrine or through that adrenaline, through the cold shock response. So I mean, is that consistent with what you read? And
Yeah, I mean, the brown fat story, I know people are very evangelical about it, and the guy to go to for me with that is a guy called Walter D. van Marken Lichtenbelt, who published a paper in 2021. He was a real advocate for brown fat initially, and he's written a really nice review paper, which is now 2 or 3 years old, on human brown fat a decade later, and has come to the conclusion that some of the claims initially made about for brown fat were probably over egged. And as with everything else in physiology, it's an integrative thing. So he actually comes to the conclusion that it's not going to be the magic thermogenic bullet. It's not going to produce sufficient heat, in terms of thermal heat production to keep you warm. But it probably does, in combination with skeletal muscle, liver, the cardiovascular system, the CNS, work with those tissues to combat things like metabolic syndrome and some lifestyle factors that are impacted by, poor nutrition and low physical activity. So there's definitely a role for brown fat. I don't think that it's a thermogenic role. I think it's more a metabolic role. We can put the link to that paper if people want to bone up on that.
yeah, definitely. Any links we can put in the show
Yeah,
notes. And
I mean
um,
the other point, which takes us full circle really, because we're back to where we started talking about people exposing themselves to cold, to heat. It's kind of interesting that whilst this has been done for, most people are doing it, if you look at the literature, for mental health reasons. I mean, the studies that have been done looking at different age groups, they all talk about perceived mental health benefits until you get to the 65-year-olds and above, who talk about it being for fitness as well. So it is a perceived mental health benefit. However, we're also seeing creeping into the clinical literature people going into the heat and going into the cold for a whole range of clinical conditions, where we've now got to the point where people can't go out and exercise. They become too unfit. So now you're simulating the kind of temperature changes you see by exercise or by being in a cold environment overnight artificially, and seeing benefits for a whole range of clinical conditions. So when you say what's going to happen in the next 10 years, I think one of the things we'll see in the next 10 years, unless we change our lifestyle, we'll see exposures to heat, cold, for a wide range of physical and mental conditions being, proposed in terms of clinical interventions. So you may well go and get a prescription for, 10 cold water immersions, or or a recommendation to go and join a group that does this. I wrote a paper. We'll put a link into the thing on, the importance of perturbing the homeostatic systems of the body, and in that gives a whole list of all the different kinds of conditions, from type 2 diabetes, some inflammatory conditions, depression, that seem to be benefiting from controlled exposure to extreme environments.
That's fascinating. I think it's an interesting point of people can feel things anecdotally, but yet the need to understand that it hasn't been backed up with double-blind scientific controls to actually make the claim for sure. And I think it's this discrepancy between, it's wonderful you feel these things, but absolutes are rare birds, right? And you can't claim absolutely that this is happening through this mechanism. And I think there's a little bit of people are going too far with the hype and forgetting it's getting dislocated with the reality of where we're at from the literature. Not that people shouldn't do it, right? But as we spoke about earlier, to do it in a safe, controlled manner.
I mean, that point, just to pick up on that, but that's a point, Ben, that applies to everything. I mean, when I started, if you wanted to find out about something, you had to put in an application to the British Lending Library that would send you the paper. And you only ever found out about things through peer-reviewed scientific journals. But now, of course, there are Twitter accounts, there are blogs, there are podcasts, and not all of the information that's being provided on those is being provided by people who have got a sound understanding or a research track record in what they're doing. So one of the things people have to be more and more able to do now than perhaps 30 or 40 years ago is to have critical analytical skills, to say the kind of questions which you've asked. Okay, you've said that. What's your evidence for that? Can I see the research that you've based that on? What's the quality of the research that you've based that on? Is it valid? Is it published in a reputable journal? And we need to have those skills more and more, because we're being confronted in all areas of life with a mass of information, and we have to be the ones that sift out the wheat from the chaff.
And I think that what Eloise and I try and do with fostering this conversation through the podcast is to hold two opposing beliefs at the same time and actually just weigh them up rationally. And I think it can get hard to do in the hype of where this movement's going, and it's wonderful. People are benefiting from so much, but I think for me personally, I want to see if something's been replicated more than a couple of times. I'm interested. If it's a one-off study, might pique my curiosity, but replication is for me personally. And Mike, can I finish with some quick fire questions?
Yeah.
Great. So this is kind of on the literature. If you could know something for sure in the literature, one thing, wave a magic wand, be like, I would want to know X. What would that thing be?
Well, let's stick to the. It's more than X.
Yes, I'm
it's
sure.
about 100X. Okay, well let's stick to the area that we're talking about. I would like to know whether or not it's the initial exposure to cold that underpins the beneficial effects of going into cold water that are reported anecdotally, and whether those beneficial effects are cold related or something else. Because that way you can now be much more definitive about saying you only need to stay in for 90 seconds and you're going to get these benefits. So your chances of having to call upon the RNLI or the Coast Guard to come and rescue you, which has gone up significantly, is diminished. Beautiful answer.
Another one is, there's a nice line like, which is extremes, good or bad, often educate the best. As somebody who spent a long time studying extreme environments, what have extreme environments taught you just about life in general?
That humans are much more resilient than they think they are. And they're going to have to be much more resilient going forward. I mean, the interesting thing about extremes, about whether it be temperature, oxygen, all of the pressure, there's too little is bad for you, too much is too much is bad for you. There's an optimal amount. But the more we manage to control that optimum, the more we've become lacking in our ability to tolerate extremes. And we're going and to be resilient to change. And we're going to see that. We're going to see in the years to come, because of what we've done to our environment, climate change and increasing temperatures and cold snaps and flooding, we're going to see a need for our population to be more and more resilient. The good news is, from seeing people go into cold, into heat, to altitude, we are able to adapt and become more resilient and more acclimatized to those environments. But we need to do something in order to get to that position. So we have the potential to adapt to some of the challenges that we will face, but we need to be actively pursuing that acclimatization and adaptation and increased resilience.
Brilliant. And I think to end on safety, and how can we practice cold exposure in a safe manner? Some principles, tools, techniques that you would recommend for people starting out and people who think they're sort of
largely in response to Wim Hof shouting into a camera, anyone can do this. We published a paper fairly recently on cold water therapies minimizing risks. So we'll put a link to that in. But basically that's start with a medical. There are a whole range of conditions that would preclude you really from taking this up. And if you're thinking of taking it up to lose weight, there's lots of better things you can do, for example. So make sure that you're fit and healthy enough to take this up. So get a medical check in the same way as you would if you were going to go out and start running or doing anything. Then in terms of doing it, swim with a recognised group, swim in a safe place, analyse the weather and the swim conditions, and depending on where you're doing it. Don't stay in for more than 10 minutes. Swim parallel to the shore. Stay in your depth. Enter the water slowly. The cold shock response is bigger the faster you change the skin temperature. Avoid prolonged breath holds. Don't rely on how you feel, because as you become cold adapted, one of the things that does is it actually dissociates how you feel from how you are. And there's some classic examples of people cooling to the point of death from hypothermia without actually even ever feeling cold. And that's part of that habituation. So that's the negative side of that. If you get into difficulty, particularly in the first minutes when you've lost control of your breathing, float on your back. And that's work that we did with cold shock underpins the RNLI's Float to Live campaign. So when you first go in, if you go in accidentally, then you can float on your back until you get your breathing under control. Or if you get into problems at any time, just roll onto your back and float. You can float. And on exiting the water, remember that there's a good chance that you won't be warming up for 10, 15 minutes, depending on what you're doing, or even longer. So just think long and hard about, when you're going to go and start driving your car, or, manipulating your complex machinery. And obviously when you're in the water, go in with other people, go in with experienced people, wear stuff that can be seen. These are all commonsensical things. We've also, as part of that paper, written something for those who are now giving open water experiences to people, because obviously there have been some fairly sad events around that. And a lot of those are just to ensure that people do that and that they know where they're doing it and escape routes and things like that. But I'll put the link to the paper on there.
Please do, and we'll put it in the show notes. Mike, just lastly, where can people find you? Where can they keep up to date with what you're up to and your research?
University of Portsmouth website is not bad. It's there's my email addresses there, so if people have a specific question. ResearchGate, we try and put as much of many of our papers on there freely accessible as possible. But if people see or hear anything they want to get, then probably just drop me an email, and I'll do my best to get round to it.
Brilliant. Well, Mike, there was so many takeaways, so many valuable insights, and such actionable information for people. I really enjoyed talking to you. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thanks, Ben. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers.